Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Bill and I'm here with Steve. Morning, Steve.
Good morning, Bill.
And welcome to another episode of The Field Guides. Each episode, we pick a natural history topic, do a lot of research on that topic, and then get you out into the field and share everything that we learn. So today, we are at Knox Farm State Park. This is a state park in East Aurora, a suburb of Buffalo. It's about 600 acres, and it is the former country estate of the renowned Knox family. This estate was really managed as pasture land. So what we're looking at is about 400 acres of open meadows for actively managed for hay. And then we have about 100 acres of woodland around us. But the woods that we're walking through right now, we've actually stopped walking. But yes. The woods that we're in right now, this was managed more like an English woods. Because if you take a look around, do you see much understory?
No.
They managed this woods for fox hunting.
No way.
The woods were actually kept clean of a lot of undergrowth. But since the state has taken it over, the woods has started to take on more of an unmanaged character. But let's get on to our topic for this month.
Yeah, and especially since we don't have much time. This is our first shortened episode.
That's true. So, Steve, there's a name that I found that I think is perfect for you.
Oh, no.
All right? You're an otaku.
I feel like I've heard that. Is that like something from Japanese?
It is.
Okay,
Very good. Yeah. So, an otaku, I don't know if you would actually qualify, because an otaku is someone who is obsessed with some aspect of Japanese culture.
Okay. That would describe me when I'm reading manga, I guess.
Right. Now, the reason this segues into our topic for today,
I was wondering how this was possible,
is because the plant we're going to focus on today, Multiflora Rose, is supposedly introduced from Japan.
Right, I did see that only in one spot.
So there are different stories about how it came here, but the one that matches my segue was that it was introduced to the U.S. From Japan in 1866. All right, let's talk about ID, because the reason we stopped walking, folks, is because we actually came upon a Multiflora Rose shrub. Mm-hmm. So it's thorny. You have multiple stems, what are actually called canes, coming up out of the ground, usually from a central point, and they usually form dense thickets. Now, this one we're looking at here is there's two individuals next to each other, so it's not real dense, but that's why it was brought here. It was brought here to create wildlife habitat. It was brought here for erosion control.
When did you say it was introduced from
1866
Japan?
Is what I found.
I had that it was introduced to the U.S. in the early 1800s. Oh. By 1886, it was used as rootstocks for ornamental roses in North America. And it was planted along highways for crash barriers and to reduce headlight glare in the medians. By the 1930s, it was used as erosion control. So it began to expand into the Northeast by the 1930s. In the 1940s, it was used widely as living fences, wildlife cover, and to prevent soil erosion. And then by 1951, Multiflora Rose is being used more than any other shrub in conservation plantings in the Northeast.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, which seems sort of weird, but
because we're going to talk about how it's an invasive, and we'll talk about that. But right. Multiflora Rose creates a living fence because instead of setting up, a wooden barrier or a stone barrier, especially for livestock, you could plant a row of Multiflora Rose, and it would create a natural barrier.
Right.
You wouldn't need as much maintenance as, say, a wooden fence row would.
Right. Some jerk could come around and just kick your fence to pieces, but no one's going to come around and try to kick your thorn bush to pieces.
Because it is very thorny. You do not want to roll around in Multiflora Rose.
That's happened to you a few times, right? Your fence was kicked to pieces?
It does. It does. Can we talk about ID?
Sure.
All right. So the individual plants can grow to about 15 feet tall, but usually they're about 6 to 8 feet tall.
Yeah.
You're usually going to find it's in edge habitat. It prefers full sun, but it can grow into a forest interior.
Multiflora Rose is not shade tolerant. It does a couple interesting things in the forest interior. It initiates leaf growth earlier, and it retains its leaves a little bit longer than canopy vegetation. Oh. So it has a higher fecundity on the forest edges than in the forest interior, but it even has pretty low seedling recruitment, even in highly suitable areas. So even on the forest edges, it's not the greatest.
One source I found said a plant can produce 500,000 seeds, and another one said each plant can produce up to 1 million seeds. Even if the percentage of recruitment is low, that's still... Ooh.
We're actually going to talk about that a little bit later on why they might produce so many seeds, and not all those seeds are viable.
Right,
I think that's an important part.
That's right. I remember you mentioned that.
But one thing that I was going to say about inside the forest interior is that it survives in the forest interior without really producing any fruit. It can exist in this lag phase until suitable conditions arise. So that could be like a disturbance that opens up a bit of sunlight in the interior.
A lot of young trees do that too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
little maples and other trees will kind of sit in this lag state. waiting for a big tree to fall to create an opening.
Right.
If that disturbance doesn't come, then that individual plant is going to die.
They are perennial. Do you remember reading about layering?
Yeah. When the end of the cane touches the ground, it can actually take root.
Right.
So then you get lots of layers, and they just form these dense thickets. It makes good wildlife habitat, at least on the surface.
Right. Yeah. So there is something I did want to say about the rose family in general, and that is that in the rose family, stipules are common. Bill, do you want to say what a stipule is?
If you look at the leaf, this is a compound leafed plant. So if you would pull the leaf off where it grows from the stem,
the base,
you would be holding in your hand the leaf stem, and then there'd be a number of leaflets on it. So it would have 5 to 11 toothed oval leaflets, each about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long. And at the base of that leaf stem, at the base of the petiole, there are these winged, I just lost it, the winged stipules.
Yeah, stipules.
So they're winged, but they're fringed.
Yes.
So it looks like it has these little fringed wings at the base of the stem, and that's a great field mark because other members of the rose family, some other members do have those stipules.
But it's not going to be as deeply fringed or, I've also heard comb-like.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And I guess they extend about half the length of the leaf stalk, which we can't demonstrate here. We can't really describe what we're seeing because they're not.
We're here during the winter, folks.
Yeah, so this is what we're seeing.
So this is January. This is a barren, snowy landscape.
Right.
Yeah. So you were talking about the stipules. You were talking about the leaves. We talked about what the leaves look like.
So Multiflora Rose, Rosa multiflora, what it translates to is many flowered, and then Rosa is Latin for red. But
these are not red.
But when you get into genera like that, you can't use it so literally. Most species in North America are actually pink. They're not red. And when you look at the Multiflora Rose, it's neither pink nor red, although sometimes it can be a little pink.
Sometimes it can be pink.
Yeah,
usually
white.
It's usually white.
Yeah. So whereas the other roses will maybe have these larger flowers, the Multiflora Rose has a bunch of small little flowers all packed together in something called a panicle.
Right. So here in western New York, the native rose that I've seen most often is the swamp rose. I think that's Rosa palustris. And that has a large single pink blossom.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to distinguish from Multiflora Rose.
Right. And the flowers, just for more botanical nerds out there, they are regular flowers, which means that they're symmetrical. They're not irregular like a violet or an orchid. And also they're perfect flowers. So they're bisexual. They have both male and female parts on one flower.
They're capable of self-pollination.
Yes, they are capable of self-pollination, though the stamens are slightly turned outwards from the pistils to try to reduce the chance of that self-fertilization. Right. Oh, it's a non-native species. Maybe pollination is a limiting factor to the spread of this plant. Is it having any difficulty sexually reproducing? And it turns out it's not. It actually utilizes a lot of generalist insect pollinators. So its most common pollinator are hoverflies. You see those guys a lot. They have large heads and then also the honeybee. But one strange thing about this, even though it has all these pollinators, there is a low number of viable seeds, like we had said before, in dissected rose hips.
It produces tons of seeds, but a lot of them are not viable.
Yes.
Which would seem like, well, that's a weird thing for a plant to do. Why go through the trouble of producing seeds if they're not going to be viable? But if they're trying to fool pests.
Right. There is a pest that does devour the seeds.
I'm one. We'll talk about the fruit in just a sec.
Okay, so there was the study from, again, We Biology and Management in 2013, and they were looking at something called the rose seed megastigmus wasp. Its larvae feeds on seeds. So the female will come in, lay the seeds inside of the rose hips, actually sort of non-discriminately. So sometimes there's one larvae in a rose hip, sometimes there's up to 7. They had a pretty big range. But the problem with this was that the larvae was only found in 27% of the rose hips, and really that shows that they have a truly limited potential as a biocontrol. But even if they were planting them in more than that, 35% of rose hips had no viable seed. And while there's only 8.6 seeds per rose hip normally, 6.5 aborted seeds per rose hip is the average.
And can those larvae, they're depending on the seeds?
Yes.
So if the seeds aren't viable, the larvae aren't going to survive?
I believe so, yeah.
False attractant?
I guess, yeah. They're just trying to trick the wasp into wasting
a dummy hip.
Yeah, it's a dummy, yeah.
But that would make sense. That they're good with dealing with pests. They have different methods for reproduction. Like a lot of invasive species, they're adaptable. They can do well in different conditions.
Yep.
And that's why they're such a pain in the butt when it comes to how they fare against native species. All right, now you jumped ahead a little bit.
Sorry?
We want to talk about hips because we didn't tell people what the rose hips are. So people listening may not be familiar with that term. The fruiting body of the Multiflora Rose And what we say most roses, right, is a hip.
Yep.
Now it looks here on the Multiflora Rose, it's pea-sized. They look like red berries, but they are not berries. And they're actually not fruits. They're urn-shaped receptacles containing the fruits. Inside the rose hips, we say the fruits are in there, but they're not fleshy. They're dry, bony seed structures, and I'll let you share the term.
It's an achene.
Achene.
And when you're thinking about an achene, I don't want to get into any botanical jargon here, but it's just a fruit that contains a single seed, and that seed is attached to the ovary wall in just one little point.
Right.
So think of maybe like a sunflower seed.
A maple seed.
Like a maple seed, like a maple samara, or even strawberry seeds.
Yep. Those are all examples of achenes.
Achenes, yeah. So some people think of like maybe the whole strawberry is the fruit. That's not true. A strawberry is like an aggregate fruit.
Right.
It's holding all these achenes together.
And those little bumps on the strawberry that look like the seeds, those are not the seeds.
No.
Those are the achene. And
inside that is the seeds.
Is the
right.
seed.
Yeah, the achene is the fruit.
Yeah. It's so weird to think of, the strawberry, the part we eat that's so sweet and good, that's not the fruit. Here we have some rose hips, and I'm going to reach down and grab a couple, and I'm going to eat one. Do you want to try one?
Sure.
So I can feel the achenes in there.
Yeah, I just bit them all to pieces.
Yeah.
I wish we would have dissected one to see how many
we can do that later.
Achenes are really in it.
So it's the skin, the best way I've described it to people, I think, is it's kind of like a fruit roll-up.
I don't know.
Steve's laughing derisively at me. It kind of tastes like a cherry, vaguely fruity.
Ugh. There's a bad aftertaste sometimes. Ugh.
But they make good tea. So, rose hips, extremely high in vitamin C. Our man, John Eastman, he's in his account of Multiflora Rose, he claims that 3 rose hips contain as much vitamin C as an orange and 60 times as much as a lemon. And I did try to look those figures up, and I did find a study that looked at the vitamin and nutrient contents of different fruits, be they the fruits you'd find in the supermarket or fruits you'd find out in the wild. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but rose hips were much higher in vitamin C than oranges or lemons or
Was
things.
it per weight?
No, it was by weight.
Okay, by weight.
By weight.
Okay,
Yeah,
so you'd have to eat a lot of these things, really, to...
Well, right, because they're pea-sized.
Right,
so.
they're very small.
Yeah, let's try to find some more Multiflora Rose.
Yeah, maybe we can find some with a ton of rose hips on it, because that's going to be important for some bird and mammal interactions.
Yeah. Now, while we're on our way here, I just want to talk about one paper that I looked at. It was put out by the National Forest Service, and it was called An Assessment of Multiflora Rose in the Northern Forests. So this region of the Forest Service, if you can imagine kind of dividing our country up, if you took a section of it where the western end is the Dakotas, the southern end is like West Virginia, and then it goes up into the northeast.
So it really is like a quarter of the country.
Right, it's that's what they call the Northern Forest region.
Okay.
And in 22 out of those 24 states, they found Multiflora Rose on national forest plots.
Okay.
So they sent teams out just doing plant surveys looking for Multiflora Rose. And on average, Multiflora Rose was on a quarter of the plots.
Okay.
And here in New York State, it was present in 25 to 50% of the plots. And when it was there, when they found it, it covered 6 to 9% of the habitat. And they did find that the more roads that there were through the forests, the more Multiflora Rose they found. So
that makes sense.
It's coming in along those human-made corridors.
Yeah, just making one road through something really adds so much edge habitat.
Right. And this study was from 2014, so this is pretty recent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. All right, here's another Multiflora Rose.
Okay.
See some hips?
Yeah, a lot more hips on this one.
So we found some the other day, though. Remember those ones we found that were very dry?
Oh, they were almost black.
I wonder if those had anything to do with the non-viable seeds.
Oh, I didn't even think about it. It would have been fun to dissect and see what's up. Because the seeds, they're supposed to stay on all winter.
Right, and you'd want it to be bright red to attract wildlife. Which leads me to another study.
Oh, go ahead.
So what does the word synchronous mean?
The timing is planned in such a way where it goes along with something.
All happens together,
yeah,
right? So I found a study. Now, this is an older study. This is from 1979, but it was from Evolution. Mm-hmm. And it looked at the timing of fruiting.
Okay.
And then it looked at how plants have evolved to have their fruits develop at different times. So Multiflora Rose, its fruits really don't come out until late summer. It's really a fall and winter fruit because that's when we see it. That's when it's ready to have its seeds dispersed. But other plants that would ripen in the summertime, they do things a little differently. Their fruits ripen at different times. Even on a single plant, you'll have some of the fruits ripening at one time, and then a few weeks later, some of the other ones will ripen. So it's kind of ripening throughout the growing season. But fall and winter fruits will very often all ripen together. And the reason that they do that, obviously they're doing it on purpose, but the reason behind that is because during the summertime, the wildlife that's feeding on you, they're going to be usually on territory. They're going to be passing you on a pretty regular basis.
Right.
But you also have invertebrates to deal with. Insects that ruin it for its intended purpose of dispersing the seeds. So if you kind of hold some fruit in reserve and insects destroy your fruit that's available, say in June, well in July you're going to have a bunch more that's ripening, and hopefully the wildlife around is going to disperse those seeds.
Right.
Whereas during the winter time, like here with Multiflora Rose,
it's going to stay on the plant all winter without anything bothering
without
it.
any insects bothering it, and you're also going to have wildlife moving through at much less regular intervals. The way they worded it in the study was, the plants rely on the irregular movements of winter frugivores for seed dispersal.
Yeah.
And a frugivore is an animal that eats mostly fruit.
Right. The seed requires a period of freezing, more or less like cold stratification. And also, and something that I found sort of interesting is that the seed can remain viable in the soil for a decade or longer.
Yeah, I found 20 years.
20 years.
I found
okay, that makes it
20 years.
Twice as hard to get rid of.
Right. Have you ever looked into a winter nest or a bird box, open it up to see what's in there in the wintertime, and you find little bits of rose hips?
No,
yeah,
I haven't seen that.
I've seen that maybe a handful of times.
Really?
And that's evidence that white-footed mice are in the neighborhood.
Nice.
Because they'll often feed on rose hips. They're going for the seeds, and they'll leave the hip, the outside behind.
I actually do want to bring up white-footed mice in a second, but there's a lot of birds that eat this. But really, it's not a big part of their diet. It's really just a secondary type of food. It's not the best food in the world. But the one bird that we might be able to consider it the main bird associate with Multiflora Rose is the northern mockingbird. And a big reason for that is that by 1951, like I said, Multiflora Rose was being used more than any other shrub in conservation plantings in the Northeast. Yeah, right. And from the 50s to the 80s, the mockingbird range was also expanding. There was the study done in the Journal of American Birds in 1982, and they found that 31% of the diet was Multiflora Rose.
Wow.
But when you go by dry weight, it's 72, almost 73% of the dry weight, and it's about 73% of the calories that the bird is getting. There was a few sumacs in the diet. There was a honeysuckle in the diet.
Man, they eat crap.
They actually get this slight positive energy balance when they're feeding on it, and they also use it as nesting locations, like some other bird species do. So with the white-footed mice, what you were saying, sometimes you'll see it in like nest boxes. You can also see it in sometimes there will be nests in the Multiflora Rose.
Oh, yeah.
And if the nest is abandoned, the white-footed mice may actually reuse that nest for their own nests. And you could look for piles of chewed-apart rose hips on that nest to sort of see that. There's other mammals that use Multiflora Rose: black bears, skunks, squirrels, white-tailed deer, rabbits, beavers, meadow voles. There's a lot of stuff that uses it.
But it's not a preferred food.
Right.
Unless you're a mockingbird.
Right. Although there was one study in 2014 that found that deer may actually help keep honeysuckle and Multiflora Rose in check. So sometimes
deer are doing something good.
Sometimes, for once, deer, it's not the deer's fault.
No.
It was our fault.
Now we can see evidence here of deer feeding. Do you see that?
No. How do you tell that again?
So since deer don't have those upper front teeth, when they grab onto the end of a branch, they're just ripping and pulling. So here you can see it.
So if you see a clean cut, what are you looking at?
So if you see a clean cut, like a 45-degree angle, then you're looking at someone with very sharp front teeth, and that's probably going to be
like a rabbit?
Around here. It'd be an eastern cottontail.
Okay.
Now, a few episodes back, we talked about pigments in leaves. We could talk about that here because one of the studies I found talked about birds, and it was wondering if they're selecting fruits for their anthocyanin compounds.
Right.
So when we think of anthocyanins, that's one of the pigments that you can find. Sometimes it shows up in fruits, sometimes it shows up in leaves. And this study looked at, were birds selecting fruits to get them ready for migration? Because when you have plants with these anthocyanin compounds, they're going to have a lot of antioxidants.
If you're doing aerobic exercise and
you're using oxygen
and you're alive,
yeah.
Reactive oxygen species, aka free radicals more or less, that's an unavoidable byproduct of respiration. And what they'll do is they'll bind to things that they're not supposed to. It causes oxidative stress and it's very bad for the animal. For birds in particular, they're exposed to high levels of oxidative stress from like long distance flights, like migration.
Right.
They're really going to have to somehow offset this. And this study looked at dietary antioxidants.
So they looked at 5 or 6 different plants that produce berries that are eaten by migrating birds. And they looked at some that have purple berries and some that have red berries. Now,
both we know are anthocyanins.
Anthocyanins.
Yeah.
And in this particular study, the 2 species that were purple, arrowwood and Virginia creeper, those have higher levels of anthocyanins in them. The oriental bittersweet, the Multiflora Rose, and winterberry.
Sure.
Those were the ones with lower anthocyanins.
And they were consumed at a very slow rate.
Right, so the birds were selecting for the purple berries with the higher anthocyanins.
Right.
So the study concluded that birds may select anthocyanin-rich fruits during migration to protect themselves from the potentially damaging effects of oxidative stress.
Right, so we're thinking about antioxidants still. And there's 2 very important categories of antioxidant. So you have hydrophilic antioxidants, and those are attracted to or they're dissolved by water. And then you have the lipophilic antioxidants, and those are dissolved in fats or oils. They studied all these different fruits from all these different species that are present during specifically migration time, and they found no difference between fruits in terms of the hydrophilic antioxidants. But they found significant differences in the lipophilic antioxidants, so the antioxidants that are dissolved in fats.
They're going to stick around for a while.
And they have 2 different types of lipophilic antioxidants. There's something called tocopherols and carotenoids.
Oh, I've seen those tocopherols, yeah.
Yep.
They add those to foods.
Do they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're a lipophilic antioxidant. And there was differences, like I said. So there were some fruits that were high in tocopherols, the viburnum, so maybe like arrowwood, and also northern bayberry. And then there was other plants that were high in carotenoids, or carotenoids, whatever. Like oriental bittersweet, another non-native invasive.
That was awesome.
Non-native invasive.
I like non-native invasive.
I might keep that in your nose.
You should.
Okay, the ones that were high in carotenoids were oriental bittersweet and Multiflora Rose. And so what this study is showing is that birds are getting different types of antioxidants depending on the fruits that they consume. Viburnum, the arrowwood, it actually was the highest in fat, it was the highest in total lipophilic antioxidants, and it was the highest in tocopherols. And it was also consumed the most. So what we're seeing is that lipophilic antioxidants, especially tocopherols, they may be important in antioxidants for birds during autumn migration, whereas in oriental bittersweet and Multiflora Rose, there was exceptionally high levels of carotenoids, which had a negative relationship with consumption. So it seemed like the more carotenoids there were, the less the birds were consuming it. Chokeberry, bittersweet, and Multiflora Rose, they were the lowest in fat, they were the highest in carbohydrates, but they were among the lowest in total lipophilic antioxidants and tocopherols, and they were the least consumed species.
Now, is this on just, they were looking at migrating birds, or just...
This is migrating birds.
Okay.
Right. Antioxidants, they're very important, but they're not all the same. And they're not all valued in the same way.
Yeah, because there's a lot of different antioxidants out there.
Right. Birds may avoid some antioxidants to get other antioxidants. So.
Yeah, because my study was just looking at anthocyanins.
Right.
They weren't looking at carotenoids or what are the other ones?
Tocopherols.
Tocopherols.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there was another study from the Northeast Naturalist in Rochester. Birds need to refuel at their stopover spots during migration. Native fruits in this study had the highest fat, anywhere from 7% to 49% fat, which is a lot of fat.
Yeah.
This included different dogwood species, arrowwood, viburnum. Arrowwood comes up in almost all the studies that I find on this. And then spicebush. Every single invasive in this study had less than 1% fat. So this is like problem species like common buckthorn, Multiflora Rose, European cranberry bush, which I've never come across. And then you have some of the Lonicera's, honeysuckles. And another interesting part of the study was they looked at the water content. The lowest water content out of all the species was Multiflora Rose.
That makes sense.
Yeah, very low water content.
Those hips are dry.
But still, but surprisingly high still. It was 55.91%. water content. And then in Lonicera, it was 88.77%.
Now that makes sense. Those are some wet fruits.
Multiflora Rose, common buckthorn, and the Lonicera, the honeysuckles, they had very low consumption, whereas dogwoods and the viburnums, they were much more valuable than non-native shrubs. Not only did they have these higher fat contents, but generally they had higher water content, except for the Lonicera, which had the highest water content. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about in the winter, right? You lose water very easy. Every time you breathe out,
you're losing water.
Right, yeah, because the difference between the relative humidity inside your body versus outside your body, you're losing more water during the winter than you are in the summer. A lot of people don't think about that. That has nothing to do with what I'm about to talk about. So we just talked about consumptive uses, but there's just one quick thing I want to say about non-consumptive uses.
You're going to talk about nesting.
Yes, nesting. And we already touched on this a little bit, but go ahead.
There's something that we haven't been talking about and we need to talk about.
Sure.
And we got to get it in. And that is invasive species.
Absolutely. Do you want to walk and talk?
Yeah, let's walk.
Okay, cool.
Because I'm getting a little chilly.
Oh, and you've always been on this side.
Okay.
Give the audience a little bit. The 3D. That's going to be the most annoying thing to listen to. All right, go ahead.
Maybe this seems obvious to some people, but I feel you need to make a distinction when you're talking about exotic plants that are not native. You can have invasive exotics, but you can also have non-invasive exotics.
Right.
Multiflora Rose is an invasive exotic. It tends to take over and form pure or almost pure stands of itself.
Right.
So it decreases the biodiversity of the habitats that it's in.
And that's the big takeaway.
Right.
That biodiversity is going
key.
down. Yeah.
We want habitats to be as biodiverse as possible. And Multiflora Rose isn't helping to make that happen. It's working against that. You can have exotic plants that aren't invasive. They're not going to decrease the biodiversity in a substantial way.
Yeah.
And you can even have invasive native plants. Like black locust trees, in certain conditions, can be an invasive tree, even though they're native.
Yeah.
So what we're getting into now in this last part of this episode is Multiflora Rose and its use as a nesting site.
Mm-hmm.
So we also got to point out that not every aspect of invasive plants are bad.
Yeah.
They can benefit some wildlife, like you said, the mockingbird, even though Multiflora Rose has spread across the continent.
But does the mockingbird need to be up that far in the Northeast?
Probably not. And is the mockingbird spreading because the Multiflora Rose is spreading? Or are both of them spreading because of some other change in the landscape? We could talk about ecological traps. So there's a general sense in the research that I found that invasive species can be an ecological trap, and that is they may be attractive to wildlife species, but in the long run, they're not going to be beneficial to them.
Sure, like fast food restaurants.
Exactly.
Let's start naming names. So.
We don't want to.
We just get sued.
We don't want to discourage any potential sponsors.
Right.
So, the studies that I found, though, that looked at Multiflora Rose, when you look at nesting, those non-consumptive uses you're talking about, there wasn't a huge detriment to lots of birds. Were you finding that?
I didn't see that it was bad.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't see that either. So why don't you introduce what you have?
There's a few bird species that use Multiflora Rose for nesting. Northern cardinals, gray catbirds, northern mockingbirds. There's a study in northeastern Illinois.
Okay.
What they found was that when you increase the proportion of invasive trees, you decrease the relative abundance of both aerial sailors and ground nesters.
Oh.
So both nesting and just flying overhead. But shrub nesters showed a positive response towards invasive shrubs and whatnot.
When you say positive response, do you mean they were choosing it to nest in, or they were successfully nesting in it more often?
I believe it would be successfully nesting.
Okay, all right.
This sort of brings up a problem. If we have some species benefiting from invasive plants, what's going to happen when we just tear them all out, right? We have this renovation project. We're like, oh, we don't want these plants. We rip them all out. Suddenly, those birds aren't doing as well, right?
Right.
What the study's suggesting is that we can remove the invasive trees. That's fine. There doesn't seem to be much of a detriment to that. But let's just thin the invasive understory plants, especially when native plants are very few in number in that area. Mm-hmm. So don't just clear everything out. That's the big takeaway from the study.
I think it's important to say that, yes, invasive species have many detrimental effects, but it's not so simple as we'll just get rid of them and then everything will be fine.
Right, yeah, that's not a responsible management plan.
What's wrong?
Multiflora Rose, more like Multiflora Blows, right? So I'm not going to try to pretend like I like Multiflora Rose.
No.
You just have to be careful of when you're trying to deal with it, right?
Right.
So let me just sort of end on a little factual rhetoric. And I don't want to end on a positive note, like, oh, we can leave some of the Multiflora Rose. What I'm going to say is that in the U.S. alone, there are about 1,000 plant species that are either threatened or endangered, and about 40% of those are at risk from invasive species, either due to direct or indirect contact. So maybe predation or competition or something. And I don't know, the only positive effect of Multiflora Rose is cover for wildlife.
Right.
Woo!
There's lots of natives that provide cover for wildlife.
Exactly right. Yeah. And I think that's an important part where, sure, there is some value, but there's still a problem there.
Right.
And we can't say, oh, it's fine. We just have to be careful of the way we manage it. We can't just rip it out. I feel like I'm making it sound easy, but it's a complicated thing, and we just got to be careful.
It needs to be thoughtful.
Right, it has to be thoughtful. I like that. So that's more or less what I have. Do you have anything more?
Well, I think that's a good place to stop.
Right.
Because ending with Steve's speech, I think, is
my beautiful Multiflora Blows speech.
It'll be like the I Have a Dream speech in years to come. All right, so I think we want to end with a few things here. First, we want to tell people, check our website for Works Cited if you're interested in the studies that we've talked about. And we also want people to check for the mistakes that we will discover in editing and through listening to the podcast ourselves. We'll post any mistakes and corrections that we find along the way.
Yeah, I just sort of reread a lot of the notes and mistakes. I like them. I think they're just as good as the episode itself.
And then I also did want to encourage people to please leave a review on iTunes for us. Mm-hmm. I wanted to read one of the reviews that we have. So Steve didn't want me to read this because he's a humble guy. He felt like we're tooting our own horn. But
I may be the most humble person out there, I think.
But Jamie Jorgensen, he said, love these guys. This is my favorite natural history podcast. Each episode is packed with information, and I really love the feel that recording in the field gives. So thank you, Jamie, for taking the time to leave that review. And we encourage all the listeners to do that, too.
I was a little suspicious. I was like, that is such a nice review. So I checked. I was like, we don't have any friends in common. And that was a nice feeling. We reached out to someone that we don't know. So that's cool.
All right, folks. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.